My name is Samuel Morrison, and in the summer of 1887, I was a broken man watching my life's work die under the merciless Arizona sun. I had been farming the same 160 acres of land outside Tucson for 12 years, building what I thought would be a legacy for my children and their children after them. But that summer, the worst drought in living memory was destroying everything I had worked to build. And I was facing the very real possibility that I would lose not just my farm, but my family's future. The drought had started in early spring, and continued relentlessly through June and July, day after day. The sun blazed down from a cloudless sky, baking the earth until it cracked like broken pottery. My corn, which should have been waist-high and green, stood stunted and brown in the fields. The wheat I had planted with such hope in March had withered to nothing more than brittle stalks that crumbled at the touch. Even my hardy desert vegetables, plants that were supposed to thrive in Arizona's harsh climate, were dying despite my desperate attempts to keep them alive with the little water I could spare. The well that had served my family faithfully for over a decade was running dangerously low. Each morning, I would lower the bucket deeper and deeper, praying that I would still find water at the bottom. Each evening, I would ration what little I had drawn, giving most of it to my wife Sarah and our 3 children, keeping just enough for the most critical crops, and hoping that tomorrow might bring rain. But tomorrow never brought rain. It brought only more heat, more sun, and more despair. Sarah tried to maintain hope for the sake of our children, Mary, age 10, Thomas, age 8, and little Rebecca, who had just turned 5. But I could see the worry in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. I could hear her crying softly at night when she thought I was asleep. She knew, as I knew, that we were facing financial ruin. The bank in Tucson had already sent one letter demanding payment on our mortgage. If the crops failed completely, we would lose everything. The situation was made worse by the growing tension between the white settlers in our area and the Apache tribes who had lived on this land for generations before we arrived. The Apache Wars had officially ended several years earlier, but fear and mistrust still ran deep on both sides. Many of my neighbors spoke of the Apache as if they were demons rather than human beings, blaming them for everything from missing livestock to failed crops. "Those savages are cursed," my neighbor Jacob Henley would say whenever we gathered at the general store in town. "Nothing good grows where they've walked. Mark my words, Samuel, this drought is their doing. They've got their medicine men casting spells on our land." I had never put much stock in such talk. I was a practical man who believed in hard work, good soil, and the Lord's providence. But as the drought continued and my situation grew more desperate, I found myself wondering if there might be some truth to the stories. Perhaps there were forces at work that I didn't understand, powers that could affect the land in ways that went beyond simple weather patterns. It was in this state of mind, desperate, fearful, and grasping for any explanation for my misfortune, that I encountered the stranger who would change everything. There was a Tuesday evening in late July, and I had spent the day trying to save what remained of my vegetable garden. The temperature had reached 115 degrees, and even though the sun was setting, the air still shimmered with heat. I was walking back to the house, my shirt soaked with sweat and my hands blistered from working with the hoe, when I saw a figure approaching across the desert. At first, I thought it might be a mirage. The heat could play tricks on a man's eyes. But as the figure drew closer, I could see that it was real. A man walking steadily across the barren landscape, carrying what appeared to be a small bundle of belongings. As he came within 50 yards of my property, I could see that he was an Apache. He was tall and lean, probably in his 40s, with long black hair and the weathered skin of someone who had spent his entire life under the desert sun. He wore traditional Apache clothing, a breechcloth, moccasins, and a shirt that looked like it had been made from deer hide. But what struck me most was his bearing. He walked with a dignity and purpose that commanded respect, even from a distance. My first instinct was fear. Everything I had heard about the Apache, every story of raids and violence, flooded through my mind. I thought about my family and the house behind me, about my responsibility to protect them. My hand moved instinctively to the rifle I kept propped against the porch post. But as the man drew closer, I realized that he posed no immediate threat. He was alone, he carried no visible weapons, and his pace was steady but not aggressive. When he reached the edge of my property, he stopped and raised his hand in what I recognized as a gesture of peace. "Good evening," he said in clear, accented English. "I am called Naalnish. I am traveling east and seek only a place to rest for the night. I will cause no trouble." I stood there for a moment, unsure how to respond. Everything I had been taught about the Apache told me to order him off my land, to threaten him with my rifle if necessary. But something about his manner, his calm dignity, his respectful distance, his straightforward request made me hesitate. "Where are you traveling to?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite my nervousness. "To the reservation at San Carlos," he replied. "I have family there. I have been walking for many days." I knew about San Carlos. It was a government reservation about 100 miles east of Tucson, where many Apache had been forced to relocate after the end of the wars. The conditions there were said to be harsh, with poor land and insufficient supplies. The fact that this man was voluntarily going there suggested that he had few other options. You're a long way from San Carlos, I said. Yes, I have been. Delayed by circumstances, I hoped to reach the trading post at Benson tonight, but I misjudged the distance. I seek only shelter until dawn, then I will continue on my way. I looked at this man, this Apache who was supposed to be my enemy, and tried to reconcile his polite, dignified manner with everything I had been told about his people. He didn't look like a savage or a demon. He looked like a tired traveler who needed help. There's a barn behind the house, I heard myself saying. You can sleep there if you want. There's hay for bedding and a water trough for the animals, though the water's not much good for drinking. Naalnish nodded gravely. I am grateful for your kindness. I have my own water. He gestured to a gourd hanging from his belt. Jeff, keep to the barn, I added, suddenly aware that I was taking a significant risk. My family's in the house, and they might be frightened if they see you. I understand. I will not disturb your family. As Naalnish walked toward the barn, I stood watching him, wondering if I had just made a terrible mistake. What would my neighbors think if they knew I had given shelter to an Apache? What would Sarah say when I told her? Was I putting my family in danger for the sake of a stranger? But as I watched him settle into the barn, arranging his few belongings with careful precision and settling down in the hay with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to sleeping rough, I felt that I had done the right thing. There was something about this man that inspired trust rather than fear. I went into the house and told Sarah about our unexpected guest. As I had expected, she was alarmed. Samuel, are you out of your mind? An Apache? Here, what if he's dangerous? What if there are others nearby? He's alone, Sarah. He's just a man trying to get to the reservation. He'll be gone in the morning, but the children, The children will be fine. He's staying in the barn, and I'll keep watch. I couldn't just turn him away, Sarah. It wouldn't have been Christian. Sarah wasn't entirely convinced, but she trusted my judgment. We agreed that I would sleep lightly and check on the barn periodically during the night. We also agreed not to tell the children about our guest until morning, to avoid frightening them. That night, I lay awake listening to every sound from outside. Several times I crept to the window to look toward the barn, but I saw no signs of movement or trouble. Whatever Naalnish was doing out there, he was doing it quietly. Around midnight, I decided to check on him directly. I took my rifle and walked quietly to the barn, not sure what I expected to find. As I approached, I could see a faint light coming from inside, not the flickering light of a fire, but something softer and steadier. I peered through a gap in the barn wall and saw something that I still struggled to explain, even all these years later. Naalnish was sitting cross-legged in the center of the barn, his eyes closed and his hands resting on his knees. Around him, the air seemed to shimmer with a soft blue-white light that had no apparent source. He was chanting softly in what I assumed was Apache, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to match the pulsing of the strange light. But what truly amazed me was what was happening to the plants in and around the barn. We had stored some seed corn in the barn, and I could see that the kernels were beginning to sprout, sending out tiny green shoots even though they hadn't been planted or watered. The few weeds that grew around the barn's foundation were standing taller and greener than they had been that afternoon. Even the old apple tree that grew near the barn, which had been dropping its leaves from drought stress, seemed to be reviving. Watched for several minutes, transfixed by what I was seeing. This was clearly some kind of Apache ceremony or ritual, but its effects seemed to be very real and very beneficial to the plant life around the barn. As I watched, I began to feel a sense of hope that I hadn't experienced in months. If this man could somehow help plants grow, perhaps he could help save my crops. But I also felt a deep sense of unease. What I was witnessing challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. I was a Christian man who believed in the power of prayer and the providence of God, but I had never seen anything like this. Was this some kind of magic? Was it evil? Was it something I should fear rather than hope for? Eventually, the light began to fade, and Naalnish's chanting grew quieter. I crept back to the house, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, alternating between excitement and worry about what I had witnessed. When dawn came, I dressed quickly and went outside to check on my guest. I expected to find him preparing to leave, as he had promised. Instead, I found him standing in my cornfield, his hands resting gently on the stalks of my dying corn. "Good morning, Samuel Morrison," he said without turning around. "Your land is very sick. You know my name. I asked in town yesterday. People spoke of the farmer who was losing his crops to the drought. They said you were a good man, but that the land was cursed. And what do you think? Is it cursed?" Naalnish turned to face me, and I was struck by the intelligence and compassion. In his eyes, not cursed, forgotten. The land has forgotten how to hold water, how to nourish life. It needs to be reminded. Can you remind it? Naalnish studied my face for a long moment. "Why do you ask?" "Most of your people would not want help. From an Apache?" "Because I'm desperate," I said honestly. "Because my family will starve if these crops fail. Because I saw what you did in the barn last night, and I think you might be able to help. You watched me. I'm sorry. I was worried about my family's safety, but what I saw, it gave me hope." Naalnish nodded slowly. "Hope is good. But what I can do requires trust. Do you trust me, Samuel Morrison?" I looked at this man, this Apache, who was supposed to be my enemy, and realized that I did trust him. Despite everything I had been taught, despite all the fear and prejudice that surrounded his people, I believed that he wanted to help. Yes, I said, I trust you. Then I will try to help your land remember. But you must understand what I do may seem strange to you. It is the old way, the way my people have worked with the land for many generations. Some of your people would call it witchcraft. I don't care what they call it, I said. If you can save my crops, if you can save my family, then I'll call it a miracle. Naalnish smiled, the first time I had seen him show any emotion other than calm dignity. Then let us begin. What happened over the next 18 hours challenged everything I thought I knew about farming, about the natural world, and about the Apache people I had been taught to fear. Naalnish didn't just help my crops, he performed what I can only describe as a miracle that saved not only my farm, but my entire understanding of what was possible in this world. First, Naalnish said as we stood in my dying cornfield, you must understand that your people and my people see the land very differently. You see, soil, water, plants, separate things that you try to control. We see one living system, all connected, all breathing together. He knelt down and scooped up a handful of the cracked, dry earth. This soil is not dead, Samuel. It is sleeping. It has forgotten its purpose because it has been cut off from the songs that keep it alive. Songs? Everything in nature has a song, a vibration, a frequency that connects it to the whole. The wind has a song, the water has a song, the corn has a song. When these songs are in harmony, life flourishes. When they are forgotten or broken, life struggles. Naalnish stood and began walking slowly through the field, his hands extended as if he were feeling for something invisible. Your land's songs have been disrupted, not by any curse, but by methods of farming that ignore the natural rhythms of this place. As he walked, he began to hum a low melodic sound that seemed to resonate from deep in his chest. The melody was unlike anything I had ever heard, complex and haunting, with variations that seemed to mirror the patterns of wind and water. What are you doing? I asked. Listening, he replied without stopping his humming. Every piece of land has its own song, its own need. I must learn this land's song before I can help it remember how to sing. For the next hour, Naalnish walked through every section of my farm, the cornfield, the wheat field, the vegetable garden, even the area around the well. Sometimes he would stop and place his hands on the ground, closing his eyes as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Other times he would pick up handfuls of soil, smell it, even taste it. Your well, he said finally, is not just low on water. It has lost its connection to the underground streams that feed it. The water is there, but it cannot find its way to you. How can you know that? The same way you know when your wife is sad, even when she doesn't speak. The land tells me its troubles. Naalnish led me to the well and asked me to draw up what water remained. There was perhaps 2 feet of water at the bottom of a well that had once been 20 feet deep. This water is sick, he said after cupping some in his hands and tasting it. Not poisoned, but disconnected. It has forgotten that it is part of the great cycle of water that moves from sky to earth to sky again. Can you fix it? I can remind it. But first, we must prepare the land to receive what the water wants to give. What followed was the most extraordinary agricultural lesson I had ever received. Naalnish taught me that Apache farming wasn't just about planting seeds and hoping for rain. It was about understanding the relationships between all the elements that made life possible: soil, water, air, sun, plants, and even the insects and animals that lived on the land. Your corn is dying not just from lack of water, he explained as we examined the withered stalks. It is dying from loneliness. Corn is a social plant. It grows best when it is part of a community of plants that support each other. He showed me how I had planted my corn in straight rows with nothing else growing between them, creating what he called green deserts, where the soil was exposed to the harsh sun and wind. In the old way, we plant corn with beans and squash, the 3 sisters. The corn gives the beans something to climb. The beans put nutrients back into the soil, and the squash spreads across the ground to keep the soil cool and moist. They sing together, help each other, make each other strong. But I don't have beans or squash planted, I said. No, but the land remembers. The seeds of many plants sleep in this soil, waiting for the right conditions to wake up. We can call them. Began what he called the awakening ceremony. He started by creating a mixture of water from my well, soil from different parts of my farm, and what he said were sacred plants that he carried with him. He ground these together in a small clay bowl, chanting in Apache as he worked. What are those plants? I asked. Medicine plants. Sage for cleansing, sweetgrass for calling good spirits, tobacco for carrying prayers to the sky. Each has its own power, its own song. As he worked, the mixture in the bowl began to emit a sweet, earthy smell that reminded me of rain on desert soil. He added a few drops of his own saliva to the mixture, explaining that this connected his spirit to the ceremony and made him responsible for its effects. Now, he said, we must sing the water awake. Naalnish led me to the well and began a new chant, this one deeper and more rhythmic than his earlier humming. He poured a small amount of his plant mixture into the well water, and I watched in amazement as the water began to change. At first, it was subtle, The water seemed to become clearer, more vibrant. But as Naalnish continued chanting, I could swear that the water level was rising. Not quickly, but steadily, as if underground springs were responding to his call. "How is this possible?" I whispered. "Water wants to flow, wants to nourish life," Naalnish replied without breaking his chant. "Sometimes it just needs to be reminded of its purpose." After about 30 minutes, the water level in the well had risen by nearly 3 feet. The water was clearer than I had seen it in months, and when I tasted it, it was sweet and clean. "Now we wake the soil," Naalnish said. We returned to the cornfield, where Naalnish began the most elaborate ceremony I had witnessed yet. He created a large circle in the center of the field, marking it with stones and small piles of his plant mixture. Then he began to dance. It wasn't like any dance I had ever seen. Naalnish moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his entire life in harmony with the natural world. His steps seemed to follow patterns that matched the contours of the land, and his movements created rhythms that echoed the sound of wind through cornstalks. As he danced, he sang not just with his voice, but with his entire body. The song seemed to come from the earth itself, rising up through his feet and flowing out through his hands into the air around us. And as he sang and danced, things began to happen that I still struggled to believe, even though I witnessed them with my own eyes. The soil within his circle began to darken and soften, as if it were absorbing moisture from the air. Small green shoots began to emerge from the ground, not just corn, but beans, squash, and dozens of other plants that I didn't recognize, but that seemed perfectly suited to the desert environment. "The seeds were always here," Naalnish explained. As he continued his dance, "Seeds can sleep in the soil for many years, waiting for the right conditions. The ceremony doesn't create life, it awakens life that was already present." As the afternoon wore on, the circle of green growth expanded. Outward from where Naalnish was dancing, my dying corn stalks began to straighten and show new growth. The cracked soil softened and darkened. Plants that I had never seen before began to emerge, creating a diverse ecosystem that seemed to thrive in conditions that had been killing my monoculture crops. "Why is this working?" I asked during a brief pause in the ceremony. "Because we are working with the land instead of against it," Naalnish replied. "Your farming methods fight the desert. Try to force it to become something. It is not Apache farming works with the desert, helps it become the best version of itself." As evening approached, Naalnish's ceremony reached its climax. He stood in the center of the green circle and raised his arms to the sky, singing a song that seemed to call to the clouds themselves. And incredibly, impossibly, clouds began to gather. At first, they were just wisps of white against the blue sky. But as Naalnish continued his song, they grew thicker and darker. The air began to feel different, humid, charged with electricity, pregnant with the possibility of rain. "Is this real?" I asked, staring at the sky in disbelief. "Rain is always real," Naalnish replied. "Sometimes it just needs encouragement to fall where it is needed most." As the sun set, the first drops began to fall, not the violent, destructive downpour that sometimes came to the desert, but a gentle, steady rain that soaked into the soil without running off. The plants seemed to lift their leaves to welcome the water, and I could almost hear them sighing with relief. The rain continued through the night, and I stood on my porch watching in wonder as my farm was transformed. By morning, the change was so dramatic that I could hardly believe I was looking at the same land. My corn, which had been brown and dying the day before, now stood tall and green. The beans and squash that had emerged during Naalnish's ceremony were already showing strong growth. The soil was dark and rich, and everywhere I looked, I could see signs of abundant life. But perhaps most amazing of all was the well. When I checked it that morning, it was full to the brim with clear, sweet water. Not only had the water level risen, but the flow was so strong that the well was actually overflowing, creating a small stream that ran through my property and watered the plants along its banks. "How long will this last?" I asked Naalnish as we surveyed the transformed landscape. "That depends on you," he replied. "What I have done is awakened the land's natural ability to sustain itself. But you must learn to work with these natural systems instead of against them. You must learn to listen to the land's songs and respond to its needs." "Will you teach me?" Naalnish smiled. "I have already begun, but the real teacher is the land itself. Watch how the plants grow together, how they help each other. Listen to the sounds of the wind and water. Feel the rhythms of the seasons. The land will teach you everything you need to know." As we stood there in the morning sun, surrounded by the miracle of green growth and flowing water, I realized that my understanding of the world had been fundamentally changed. I had witnessed something that science couldn't explain, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about farming, about nature, and about the Apache people. "Naalnish," I said, "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You've saved my farm, my family's future. How can I thank you?" "By remembering," he replied, "by treating the land with respect, by sharing what you have learned with others who are willing to listen, and by never forgetting that Apache people are not your enemies. We are your neighbors, and we have much to teach each other." As Naalnish prepared to continue his journey to San Carlos, I knew that my life had been changed forever, not just because my crops had been saved, but because I had learned that there were ways of understanding and working with the world that went far beyond what I had been taught. I had learned that the Apache people, whom I had been taught to fear and despise, possessed knowledge and wisdom that could benefit everyone. But I also knew that the real test was yet to come. How would I explain what had happened to my neighbors? How would I maintain these miraculous improvements to my farm? And how would I honor the trust that Naalnish had placed in me by sharing his people's ancient wisdom? 3 months after Naalnish's visit, my farm had become the talk of the entire Tucson Valley. While my neighbors continued to struggle with drought-damaged crops and failing wells, my land flourished like an oasis in the desert. Word spread quickly through the farming community, and I found myself hosting a steady stream of visitors who came to see the miracle farm for themselves. The transformation was undeniable. My corn had grown to heights I had never achieved, even in the best years, with ears so full and heavy that the stalks needed extra support. The beans and squash that had emerged during Naalnish's ceremony had created a lush understory that kept the soil cool and moist. My vegetable garden produced more food than my family could eat, and I found myself giving away surplus produce to neighbors who were struggling with their own failed crops. Most remarkably, my well had become a source of water not just for my own farm, but for several neighboring properties. The overflow from my well had created a small creek that meandered through the valley, providing irrigation water for anyone who needed it. The water was so abundant and clean that people began calling it Morrison's Spring, though I always corrected them to say that the water belonged to the land, not to me. But with the success came challenges that I hadn't anticipated. Many of my neighbors were suspicious of my sudden good fortune, and rumors began to circulate about how I had achieved such dramatic improvements to my farm. "It ain't natural," Jacob Henley declared during one of our weekly gatherings at the general store. "No man's crops grow like that without some kind of help." "What kind of help do you mean, Jacob?" I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. "Well, there's been talk. People say you had an Apache staying on your property. People say you made some kind of deal with them savages." The word savages made my blood boil, but I forced myself to remain calm. I did give shelter to a traveling Apache man for one night. He was on his way to the San Carlos reservation, and I offered him a place to sleep in my barn. It was the Christian thing to do. "And you think that's all there was to it?" Jacob's voice was full of skepticism. "You think it's just coincidence that your crops started growing like magic right after that Apache left?" "I think," I said carefully, "that sometimes when we show kindness to strangers, we receive unexpected blessings in return." But Jacob wasn't satisfied with that answer, and neither were several other farmers who had gathered to listen to our conversation. The truth was, I was struggling with how much to reveal about what had really happened. I knew that if I told the complete truth about Naalnish's ceremonies and the methods he had used, most people would either think I was lying or accuse me of practicing witchcraft. The situation became more complicated when a delegation from the territorial government arrived to investigate reports of unusual agricultural success in our area. The officials were particularly interested in my well, which had become famous throughout the territory as the only reliable water source during the ongoing drought. "Mr. Morrison," said the lead investigator, a stern man named Colonel Harrison, "we've received reports that you may have discovered a new water source or developed some kind of innovative irrigation technique. The territorial government is very interested in any methods that might help other farmers deal with the current crisis." I found myself in an impossible position. I couldn't explain the real source of my farm's success without revealing Naalnish's involvement, and I knew that any mention of Apache agricultural methods would be dismissed or, worse, seen as evidence of some kind of collaboration with hostile Indians. "I've made some changes to my farming practices," I said truthfully. "I've learned to work more closely with the natural systems of the land rather than fighting against them." "What specific changes?" Colonel Harrison pressed. "Well, I've started planting different crops together instead of in separate fields. I've learned to read the signs that the land gives about what it needs, and I've developed a deeper respect for the natural cycles of water and soil." Colonel Harrison looked skeptical. "Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, that sounds like agricultural philosophy, not practical technique. We need concrete methods that can be replicated by other farmers." The problem was that I didn't fully understand the concrete methods myself. Naalnish had taught me to observe and listen to the land, but the specific techniques he had used, the plant mixtures, the ceremonies, the songs were part of a complex system of knowledge that I had only glimpsed. I knew that the success of my farm was based on principles that went far beyond conventional agriculture, but I lacked the deep understanding necessary to teach those principles to others. It was during this period of growing pressure and scrutiny that I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in my garden one evening when I saw a familiar figure approaching across the desert. It was Naalnish, returning from his journey to San Carlos. "Samuel Morrison," he said with a slight smile, "I see that the land is still singing." "Naalnish," I exclaimed, genuinely happy to see him. "I was hoping you would come back. I have so many questions, and there are people who want to understand how the magic works," Naalnish interrupted gently. It's not magic, is it? It's knowledge. It's a different way of understanding how the world works. Yes, but to your people, knowledge they don't understand often looks like magic. And magic, to your people, is often seen as dangerous. Naalnish was right, and I knew it. The suspicion and rumors that had been growing in the community were evidence of exactly what he was talking about. I want to learn more, I said. I want to understand the principles behind what you did so that I can help other farmers. But I also want to do it in a way that honors your people and doesn't create more conflict. Naalnish studied my face for a long moment. You have changed, Samuel Morrison. When I first met you, you were a desperate man, willing to accept help from anyone. Now you are a man who thinks about the consequences of knowledge, who considers the welfare of others. You changed me. What I learned from you changed how I see everything. Then, perhaps, it is time for the next lesson. Over the following weeks, Naalnish taught me what he called the deeper songs, the principles behind Apache agricultural methods that went far beyond the specific techniques I had witnessed. He explained that Apache farming was based on understanding the land as a living system, with complex relationships between soil, water, plants, animals, and even the spiritual forces that connected all life. Your people see farming as a battle, he explained as we walked through my thriving fields. You fight weeds, fight pests, fight drought. You try to force the land to produce what you want, when you want it. Apache farming is about partnership. We work with the land to help it become its best self, and in return, it provides for our needs. He taught me to recognize the subtle signs that indicated what the land needed, changes in soil color that revealed nutrient deficiencies, patterns of plant growth that showed water flow, the behavior of insects and birds that indicated the health of the ecosystem. Every piece of land has its own personality, Naalnish said. Some land is generous and forgiving, some is stubborn and demanding, some land likes to be left alone, some land wants constant attention. A good farmer learns to read these personalities and respond appropriately, but perhaps most importantly, he taught me about the spiritual dimension of farming that Apache culture considered essential to agricultural success. Plants are not just things that grow, he explained. They are beings with their own spirits, their own purposes. When you plant corn, you are not just putting seeds in the ground, you are inviting corn spirits to come and live on your land. If you treat them with respect, if you understand their needs and desires, they will be generous with their gifts. This spiritual approach to agriculture was the most challenging aspect of Naalnish's teaching for me to understand and accept. As a Christian, I believed in the power of prayer and divine providence, but the idea of communicating directly with plant spirits seemed to conflict with my religious beliefs. Your God and our spirits are not enemies, Naalnish said when I expressed my concerns. They are different ways of understanding the same truth, that all life is connected, that all life is sacred, and that humans have a responsibility to care for the world we have been given. Gradually, I began to understand that Apache agricultural methods were not just practical techniques, but expressions of a worldview that saw humans as caretakers rather than masters of the natural world. This perspective didn't contradict my Christian beliefs, it deepened them, helping me see God's creation as a living, interconnected system that deserved reverence and careful stewardship. As my understanding grew, I began to share what I was learning with my neighbors, but in ways that they could accept and understand. Instead of talking about plant spirits or Apache ceremonies, I focused on practical observations about soil health, water conservation, and the benefits of diverse plantings. I've noticed that when I plant beans with my corn, both crops do better. I would tell other farmers, the beans seem to put something back into the soil that the corn needs. I found that if I pay attention to how water moves across my land, I can direct it to where it's needed most, instead of letting it run off and go to waste. I've learned that different plants have different needs, and if I group them according to those needs, I can take better care of all of them. Slowly, some of my neighbors began to experiment with these ideas. Jacob Henley, who had been among the most skeptical, started planting beans and squash with his corn after seeing the success I had achieved. Other farmers began paying more attention to water flow and soil health, implementing changes that improved their yields even during the ongoing drought. But the real breakthrough came when Colonel Harrison returned with a team of agricultural experts from the territorial capital. They had come to conduct a formal study of my farming methods, hoping to develop recommendations that could be distributed to farmers throughout the territory. Mr. Morrison, Colonel Harrison said, "We've been observing your farm for several weeks now, and we have to admit that your results are extraordinary. We'd like you to demonstrate your techniques for our agricultural specialists." This was the moment I had been preparing for. With Naalnish's guidance, I had developed ways to explain Apache agricultural principles in terms that conventional farmers and government officials could understand and accept. I led the delegation through my farm, explaining how I had learned to read the land's needs, how I had developed water conservation techniques that worked with natural drainage patterns, and how I had discovered the benefits of planting diverse crops that supported each other's growth. The key, I explained, is to stop thinking of farming as a battle against nature and start thinking of it as a partnership with nature. Instead of trying to force the land to produce what we want, we learn what the land wants to give and find ways to align our needs with its natural tendencies. The agricultural experts were impressed by the practical results they observed, and several of them began taking detailed notes about the techniques I demonstrated. But what impressed them most was the overall health and resilience of my farming system. "Mr. Morrison," said Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the lead agricultural specialist, "what you've achieved here is remarkable, not just for its productivity, but for its sustainability. Your soil is healthier than when you started, your water usage is more efficient, and your crops show resistance to pests and diseases that are devastating other farms in the region." "How did you develop these methods?" asked another specialist. "I learned from someone who understood the land better than I did," I replied truthfully. "Someone who taught me to see farming as a relationship rather than a conquest." Over the following months, the territorial government developed and distributed a series of agricultural bulletins based on the techniques they had observed on my farm. They called it the Morrison method, though I always insisted that the credit belonged to the Apache farmer who had taught me. The impact was significant. Farmers throughout Arizona Territory began implementing water conservation techniques, diverse planting strategies, and soil health practices that improved their yields and made their farms more resilient to drought and other challenges. But for me, the most meaningful result was the change in how people in our community viewed the Apache people. As word spread about the source of my agricultural knowledge, attitudes began to shift. People started to understand that the Apache possessed valuable wisdom about living in harmony with the desert environment. "I never thought about it before," Jacob Henley admitted to me one day, "but I guess if you're going to live in a place for hundreds of years, you'd learn a thing or two about how to make it work for you." When Naalnish visited again the following spring, he was amazed by the changes that had occurred throughout the valley. Many farms were now using techniques based on Apache agricultural principles, and the overall health of the land had improved dramatically. "I've done something very important," he told me, as we stood overlooking the green, productive farms that now dotted the landscape. "You have built a bridge between two ways of understanding the world. You have shown that Apache knowledge and white knowledge can work together to benefit everyone." "I couldn't have done it without your teaching," I replied, "and I couldn't have done it without your willingness to learn and your courage to share what you learned with others, even when it was difficult." Naalnish's visit that spring was his last. He told me that he had decided to remain at San Carlos to help his people adapt to reservation life, using his knowledge of both traditional Apache methods and the techniques that had proven successful. "With white farmers, the old ways and the new ways must learn to work together," he said. "My people need to understand how to survive in the world that is coming, and your people need to understand how to live in harmony with the land that has always been here." Years later, when I look back on that drought summer of 1887, I realize that Naalnish gave me much more than agricultural knowledge. He gave me a new way of seeing the world, a deeper understanding of my place in the web of life, and the wisdom to know that true prosperity comes not from conquering the land, but from learning to live in partnership with it. The Apache man I had been taught to fear became my greatest teacher. The stranger I sheltered for one night changed not just my farm, but my entire community's understanding of what was possible when people from different cultures shared their knowledge and wisdom. Today, my farm continues to thrive using the principles that Naalnish taught me. My children have grown up understanding that the land is not something to be owned and exploited, but something to be cared for and respected. And throughout Arizona Territory, farmers continue to use techniques that trace their origins back to the ancient wisdom of the Apache people. The dangerous Apache who slept in my barn that night turned out to be the most valuable friend I ever made. He taught me that true security comes not from fearing and fighting our neighbors, but from learning from them and working together to create abundance that benefits everyone. The end. Legal disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and was created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental.